Welcome to the Multiverse of Misinformation, a podcast about misinformation and the way it affects the many facets of our life, produced by the California Center for Ethics and Policy, or CCEP, at Cal Poly Pomona, and generously supported by the Cal Poly Pomona Special Projects for Improving the Classroom Experience Grant Program. My name is Sean Herron, Associate Librarian at Cal Poly Pomona, Faculty Fellow with CCEP, and host for this season of our podcast. Beyond the classroom, CCEP hosts a series of forums, panels, and discussions throughout the semester dealing with the chosen topic for that particular year. For this year's topic of misinformation, CCEP hosted a panel on April 11th, 2024, titled Combating Misinformation, Psychological and Structural Approaches, with a focus on what kind of concrete actions could be taken by both individuals and institutions in combating the present iterations of misinformation in the digital age. The panelists for this discussion were Tiffany Zhu, a PhD student in philosophy at the University of California, Irvine, specializing in the ethics of artificial intelligence; Ian Anderson, a postdoctoral scholar in psychology at Caltech, specializing in the effects of social media on psychology; and Sean Herron, aka me, this year's CCEP Faculty Fellow and Associate Librarian at the Cal Poly Pomona University Library, where I've been studying misinformation and teaching about it since 2017. And now, with no further ado, here is the recording of the April 11th CCEP panel, Combating Misinformation, Psychological and Structural Approaches. If you like what you hear, or if you care about these issues, please share our podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues. Thank you for listening.
Hello and good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's panel brought to you by the California Center for Ethics and Policy. My name is Anna Bachman and I am a student fellow with CCEP. I'm currently in my last semester in the psychology program, and I am the secretary for PsyChi, which is Cal Poly's chapter for the Student Honor Society in Psychology. Additionally, I am a research assistant under Dr. Autry. We are currently studying mental processes using electroencephalogram, also known as EEG. And it just so happens that belief formation and persistence of belief in misinformation is a pretty big research interest of mine. So I'm very excited to be here today. And with this, I'd like to introduce our panelists. So first we have Sean Herron. He's a librarian here at Cal Poly and this year's CCEP Faculty Fellow. He leads seminars for student fellows, myself included, on misinformation in both historical and modern contexts. This includes case studies dealing with urban legends, moral panics, and conspiracy theories. I've never had a question that he couldn't answer. Somehow he's kind of an encyclopedia, so I'm excited to hear what he has to say today. Next we have Tiffany Zhu, a PhD candidate in the Department of Philosophy at University of California, Irvine. She works primarily in social philosophy, epistemology, and applied ethics, especially relating to AI. And last but not least, we have Ian Anderson, a postdoctoral scholar in psychology at Caltech. His current research interests are how psychological and interpersonal processes are influenced by media use and human-computer interaction. So today's topic is combating misinformation, psychological and structural approaches. So we'll be discussing questions like, what steps can we take as individuals to sort accurate and important information from false or misleading information? As well as how can we redesign our social networks and institutions to become more trustworthy and transparent? So with this, I invite Sean Herron to speak.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit to start out with. As a librarian, we approach information and misinformation a little differently than some others. A lot of what we deal with has to do with techniques on how to identify what is actually useful information and what is garbage. Now, one of the things that we note, as you can kind of see from pictures, one, misinformation is not new. Particularly if we're going to look at the fine art of propaganda, what you're seeing here is you're seeing right here, we're seeing part of the Arch of Titus from Rome, which is depicting the outcome of the sack of Jerusalem, which you can see because you can see the temple menorah right there. So you have that. Here's something from ancient Egypt where Pharaoh is raising the club over a defeated enemy. And a little bit more recent, if you prefer. I love this one, show it in class a lot. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. So dang it, you better be carpooling. Because that guy, I tell you what, right away, he's a terrible sightsee driver. Okay? Another thing we see in some more modern stuff is, once again, we can look here and you can see various These are just various ads from at least one page that I turned the ad block off on my computer to see, so I've suffered for your sake. But one thing we can look at from both of these is the idea that a lot of times misinformation, whether it be propaganda, whether it be ads, whether it be scams, the idea here is that misinformation makes it a point to attract you in a way where you don't think too much about what you're looking at. Okay? It's trying to bypass your ability to think about things and go straight for your emotions. Whether those emotions are fear, as in Pharaoh with his club, whether they're pride, like, a Roman look at all these countries that we've subjugated and slaughtered and whatever, whether it's fear, like we don't want to be seen as a collaborator to someone like Hitler, whether it's lust, like the thought that person like this might be waiting for you to chat with them, maybe they are. In my case, probably directly marketed towards me, diabetes is not from sweets. Well, as any of you saw me noshing on that cookie at the beginning, this is clearly a problem in my case and other stuff here. For instance, FOMO. They don't want you owning one, but it's not illegal. It's not entirely clear who they are or what this thing is you're supposed to be owning, but, they're playing off the FOMO there. Okay, so there have been a lot of different techniques designed over time and utilized by librarians and others to evaluate information. Two of the common ones we have sitting here, because librarians are mad for acronyms, are the CRAP test. We really liked that one because it let us cuss in class. And the proven test. All of these look at certain criteria. You have currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, purpose, or in proven's case, they kind of jumble it around and add some more variables. Purpose, relevance, objectivity, verifiability, expertise, and newness. Now, all of these are great, assuming that you are in an environment where information is relatively scarce and you have the leisure to actually sit down and evaluate things. But that's not the situation we live in. We live in a situation of information overload. You are surrounded by information. It is the water you swim in, metaphorically. And you will not have time necessarily to look at every single piece of information that comes your way and subject it to this level of scrutiny. I mean, your grandchildren would die of old age before you got through a single day of information that you encounter on a regular basis. With that in mind, let's deal with some basic realities. As I just said, you're not going to be able to evaluate everything that comes your way. There just isn't enough time. But having said that, not all information you encounter on a given day necessarily needs to be subjected to in-depth analysis. There are certain things, memes, jokes, nonsense, whatever, commercials, where you're already going to try and filter that out anyways, and it may or may not be something that is a life or death question that requires deep consideration. So what I would suggest you guys to do, and what we've talked about in class, is the idea and the necessity of triage. Now, any of you who are familiar with this idea in the medical setting, you understand that triage, which is often practiced, for instance, in emergency rooms, is a set of prioritization. Who needs care immediately? They get care immediately. Who can wait a little while? They wait a little while. Who's really not a serious case? They can wait even longer. Who is going to die right now and there's nothing you can do about it? You give them palliative care, right? Make sure that they are not dying in agony, but that's about it. The same is true in a less grim sense with information. You want to consider, when you're looking at information, you might want to ask yourself the following questions before you decide what needs in-depth analysis. Do lives and health depend on this information? Okay? Is this something telling you that you can treat your cancer with essential oils? You laugh, but, let's be honest. Okay, you're definitely going to want to look into that a little clearer because, of course, the thing with cancer is it don't play and you will die. Okay? Does your livelihood depend on this information? I've got this great investment opportunity. I'm just going to need all of your savings, but I can guarantee you a 20% return. What happens if I'm a con man? Or I'm full of crap? You're going to suffer. I mean, and, you may be out of the house, lose your car, whatever. So you're going to want to look more closely at that. Does your physical safety depend on this information? This could go a whole lot of ways, okay? Is this suggesting that you mess with dangerous things? As I have electricians in my family, if this is suggesting you do your own wiring, I can hear my brother screaming from here, okay? This is something you may want to consider. And lastly, does this information place you in a legally dubious position? One of the things we talked about in class was the sovereign citizen movement and the idea that if you just say the right words, you don't have to pay taxes and no laws apply to you. You may want to look very closely at that because police find that incredibly hilarious when you try and pull that on them, and judges are usually not thrilled. So if any of the above questions are true, as far as the information you're encountering and considering, you're definitely going to want to evaluate it carefully. You're going to want to subject this to close scrutiny. Now, the method I'm going to suggest here is one that's proposed by Michael Caulfield, that gentleman right there. He's an information literacy expert at Washington State University. He's the author of Web Literacy for Student Fact Checkers. He's worked with AASCU's American Democracy Project, the National Writing Project. He's a gentleman who generally knows what he's talking about. He came up with this method. It's a revision of an earlier method he used. It's called the SIFT method. And the idea here is that it's meant to optimize the amount of time you take to actually do this because, of course, time is of the essence, and you don't always have the luxury of spending a lot of time looking at it. So it's how do we kind of streamline this process as much as possible? Once again, as I said, we are nuts for acronyms in the library field. So we have here SIFT, stop, investigate the source, find better coverage, and trace claims, quotes, and media to their original contexts. So we want to start with stop, ironically. The idea here is that misinformation goes for an emotional reaction. So the first thing you want to do is check that reaction. How is this information making you feel? Is it freaking you out? Is it pissing you off? Is it making you want to spend money rapidly? Be aware. Consider your emotions. Don't just act on them. Be aware that you might be being manipulated. And perhaps most importantly here, don't share things you haven't vetted, okay? You can't eliminate fake news. You can't eliminate misinformation. That doesn't work. We've had it from time immemorial, but you can make the decision not to share it and not participate in the problem as much as possible. The next step being investigate the source and or hover. This tends to be helpful when we're dealing with individuals in social media. Okay, determine whether or not the person or organization sharing this information is trustworthy. Does this person know what they're talking about? How can I tell? Is the source what you thought it was? Is it credible enough to share without further checking? Consider what their expertise is, what their background is. This last one here is somewhat unfortunate. Certified identity on social media. The blue check does not mean what it once did, but something to consider. Is this person actually the person they tell you are? The old joke on the internet is anyone can be anyone, right? President Trump once famously made the statement that this could be a 400-pound guy sitting on his bed in his mother's basement. Okay, could be. We don't know. Investigate the source. The next level here is also just add Wikipedia. Now, you guys might be shocked. I'm a librarian. I am advocating Wikipedia. I am. There are uses for Wikipedia. Okay, you need to use it carefully and judiciously, but it has its uses. Usually, in this case, when we're talking about publications, most reputable publications have an English language Wikipedia page. They also tend to have a list of fake news sources that they update with some regularity. Once again, you kind of have a sense here, okay, where did this come from, and are these people legit? Do they have the resources to talk about what they're doing as far as reporting? Now, the next thing, once you've determined the nature of the source, you may want to decide to find a better source talking about it. Okay, the old saw about the idea that even a stopped clock is right twice a day, right? Even if the source is bad, the story might yet be true. So you want to, and a lot of shared stories come from news aggregators, which basically use what we call the Hoover method of just sucking up all the information they can and repurposing it. So where did this come from, and are other sources that are more reputable talking about this and giving better details? And lastly, if all else fails, take keywords from the story being shared, Google it, see what else pops up. Sometimes you find that people just change the wrapper or the packaging on something to come up with other stuff. And lastly, when all else fails, and you absolutely have to, trace the story back to the original source. A lot of misinformation is not original. It involves taking real information out of context, okay? A picture of a story might be real, but when coupled with outraged commentary, the truth of the story is lost. Context is everything, guys. You have an image, but the image itself isn't going to tell you something necessarily. And in this case, access the story being shared and search keywords from the social media post in the story, if it's there, to see if the original story matches with what's been shared. So you have 4 basic steps here in sifting to try and find whether a source is reliable, accurate, etc. Now, I want to make clear right here, this is not a panacea. As I just pointed out, you don't have time to do this with everything. It's not always going to work out. Some things are going to look better than others. This is not a perfect system. It's just a basic system to try and do things. And as I said, you will need to triage what you do it with. You will not be able to do it with everything. And lastly, if you're tracing the story, check the date. And just a reminder, misinformation is the deliberate spread of false information with the goal of misleading those who consume it. And it relies on outrageous statements, so you want to try and watch your emotional reaction. Okay, I've used up enough of your time, so I'll move on.
Thank you so much. And I think next we have Anderson.
Hi, everyone. I've already had an intro, but I am currently a postdoctoral scholar at Caltech, where I work on mostly things related to social media use. So the focus of my presentation is going to be mostly related to my own prior research on social media and how misinformation leverages the structure of social media to spread. And I'm going to focus a little bit less on belief in misinformation and more about why people share it. So there are two kind of terms that I'll dive into really quickly to introduce my research. One is social learning, and the other is habit. Social learning is basically the way that we pick up and process signals from the environment, signals from other people. We learn norms, we learn what's appropriate, we learn what other people believe. And habits are basically behaviors, sometimes that you learn socially, that you pick up over time and repeat highly frequently in a particular context, such that they become kind of mindless or automatic part of your routine, right? So I'll dig a little bit more into these two, but that's just a brief kind of definitional overview to get us started here. One of the things that has been well researched in my area is how social media and our interaction with the algorithms on social media highlight and appeal to biases that we have in social learning. This is because social media systems are primarily optimized to capture the things that we find the most important or the most attention grabbing. And important is a bit of a loaded term there. So this is work by William Brady, who's a colleague of mine. We have a paper in progress together right now, actually. And what he does is he has this framework that talks about the type of information that grabs the most attention on social media. And he uses text and language analyses of tweets and posts to figure this out, divided things into these categories of prime information. One is information having to do with prestige. Another has things to do with your in-group, so people that are close to you. Another has to do with moral information. So moral outrage tends to spread further and faster than other types of information. Emotional content, and in particular, moral emotional content. So when you combine those two, you get outrage. And this kind of information grabs our attention and often dictates what gets the most likes, the most shares, and actually the type of thing that usually gets the most comments on social media are things that people disagree about, right? So then you have like lots of comments and like people battling about what the topic of the information is, whether it's true, all of these kind of things. So within the present online ecosystem, which is basically optimized to find the things that are getting people's attention, and then algorithms will sort through that and supercharge those things by showing it to more people, which then will get it more reactions and show it to more people, and the exposure of those things kind of increases exponentially. And this plays on people's social learning biases. So one way you can talk about how we learn different social norms, things that are appropriate, different behaviors, is through the things that are rewarded, right? So it basically, in the system that social media currently has, the type of information that is rewarded the most is prime information, right? Prestigious, moral, and that same acronym that I just said. That information accrues the most likes, the most attention, the most followers. And that's basically been verified across multiple social media platforms with textual data, using usually large language algorithms to like sort things by the different emotions the text contain. And those emotions correlate with getting lots of likes, lots of followers, all these kind of things. So over time, you'll get a lot of rewards if you share that kind of information. You'll likely gain influence, potentially followers, things like that, and reactions from people that you care about in your in-group. And those, over time, can build sort of more mindless or less thoughtful behaviors, which I describe as habits. So in general, so there's some stats about prime language information. It spreads about 2 times faster and further than true information. So in particular, misinformation on Twitter/X was measured to spread at about that rate. People in larger groups are also known to be less likely to fact check. So when you're in this situation where you're online and you feel the presence of other people, you're less likely to fact check the information before you're sharing it. And in addition, the people who share the most frequently, i.e. the people who have accrued probably the most rewards for sharing in the past, are also the most likely to share misinformation, because misinformation kind of rides on the coattails of prime information in a sense, right? And these people are also less sensitive to accuracy interventions. So some of solutions where people are being trained to identify misinformation in a task, and then you actually say, you present a piece of information and you say, is this accurate? They will say no, and then you'll ask, do you want to share it? And they'll still say they want to share it. And people with the strongest sharing habits on social media are the most likely to respond in that way. And usually what we saw in like the text response in the studies that we've done like this was, people are just sharing it because they want to see what other people think. They want to see how their audience responds. And the barrier to sharing for them is just much lower. They're just much more likely to click the share button because in the past, they've been rewarded for sharing that kind of information over and over and over again. And once you get a lot of rewards for sharing information like that, you're way more likely to do it again in the future. And accuracy-based thinking interventions are less likely to work on you. So the role of social media habits in this, these structures basically build up rewarded behaviors that then become habitual. In general, habits actually, even though they depend on rewards to form, they become divorced from rewards eventually, such that like the pathway to sharing becomes like cued or more basically by the context in which the person has done it in the past. So in my research, we show that like people who share a lot of content on social media and get rewarded for it a lot are affected most by platform design changes versus like actual people telling you don't share this, right? Like because they've become kind of more mindless and automatic, like the thing that actually impacts them is changing the reward structure or changing the environment. So the platforms actually have the most power to affect the people who share the most misinformation. But habits make it tough to affect people who share information with more goal-directed, accuracy-based interventions. So the interventions that we are most focused on right now, I think, actually aren't targeting some of the biggest proliferators of misinformation online. So it's a very difficult, tricky problem. So what we know about the people who share information in a more habitual and automatic way, they're less sensitive to the quantities of rewards that they get on their posts. This is my own research. They're more sensitive to changes in the platforms, and there are larger gaps between what they say their goal is in sharing information and their actual behavior. So you can basically say like, these people in survey questions will say, I care a lot about likes and reactions to my information. I care what people think about me. And then they will share more misinformation than other people. And they will also share at a more regular rate that doesn't correspond to the number of reactions they're getting. So they say they care about these things, but then their behavior will say otherwise. And in addition, my research showed that this group is less sensitive to how true and how aligned with their own political views the information that they're sharing is. So basically, I don't think it's that some of this might suggest that these people are not thinking that much, but I think that they do have a logic for why they share. It's just that the threshold to sharing information is much lower because they're repeated in the past and they've been rewarded for it many times, as I said before. One of the issues with the lace in between habits and the spread of content and the spread of misinformation on social media is that these habitual sharers often also have the loudest voices. So roughly only 25% of TikTok users produce 98% of the videos that you see on TikTok. So the actual view, like the actual content that you're seeing when you log into TikTok, and this is similarly true with Twitter or X, the content that you actually see shared there is actually being created by a smaller minority of users. And that can kind of warp you to seeing more information from people who are sharing a lot versus people who aren't saying anything. And it can warp people's view of norms. It can warp people's views of political discourse, and all sorts of other things are packaged in there as well. And then why haven't platforms really done anything about this? And I think the answer is because they profit from highly habitual sharing and highly habitual use of their platforms. So if you look at the number of users on Twitter and you correlate that over the years, so you split them out by who are the several times daily users, who are the weekly users, who are the monthly users. The thing that is most correlated with Twitter's revenue over time is people who use the site several times daily. And actually, their revenue is negatively correlated with people who use it monthly, right? Or uncorrelated. And this is true not only across Twitter, but also on Instagram and Facebook. And those are the ones that we can get data on because they're publicly traded companies, right? The reason for this is because the way they make money is that they sell advertisements. These advertisements are in their feeds. So they have a lot of smart design engineers who optimize the feeds for people to be spending as much time as possible on them, right? As much scrolling as possible, as much sharing as possible. That is what the scientists at these platforms optimize for. They do not optimize for the health of the information ecosystem. As long as it doesn't, get so bad that people leave their platforms, right? So that's kind of the only stake they really have in this game to do something about this. So yeah, that's kind of the thrust of my research, is that these platforms have a lot of power to do anything, but likely they're not going to do much because the spread of content, and with that, the spread of misinformation is actually tied into their revenue streams, because misinformation gets a lot of clicks, shares. It starts a lot of fights, which are actually beneficial for the platforms in the long run. So what do we do about this? So one way would be to actually alter and press these companies to alter the design of their platforms, stop them optimizing for attention. One thing that we did in my research was actually test a system that rewarded people for sharing accurate and true information. And lo and behold, people did stop sharing as much misinformation if you don't reward them for doing so. But there's other things that I think we can do to break our own existing habits related to sharing misinformation. Employing systems like the one Sean just talked about, I think, is one potential option for individuals to help do better on their own to heal the information ecosystem, right? I think there are tools that are existing on the social media platforms, right? You can report content when you see it. You can use Birdwatch. You can use community notes. Like, these kind of things do exist. You can try and counter it yourselves. There are papers showing that, like, asking general questions underneath misinformation posts can help stop other people from sharing it, being like, where is this coming from? What is the source? Like, so even that kind of things, if people see comments that say that under something, they do actually stop sharing it as much, although it still gets shared often. So basically trying to build countervailing habits on your own, and pushing the platforms to build structures that help build more helpful habits for people than ones that tend to spread or carry misinformation with them by accident. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Moving on to Tiffany Zhu.
Okay, so I'm going to talk. I don't have slides. I'm just going to talk about some of my work on AI ethics and philosophy of language. Okay, it sounds like it doesn't really connect to the other topics, but we'll see. Okay, so many of you know that, for instance, misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, the three big ones, can be generated by artificial intelligence and then spread via social media, right? So kind of what Ian was talking about a bit. I want to focus on something a little different and like more sneaky. So there's like a really sneaky way in which generative AI can spread misinformation. Okay, so I'm going to start with an example. So a little while ago, this meme was going around about DALL-E, like the image generator, the text-to-image AI model that's like done by the same company as ChatGPT. Okay, and you might be familiar with this. So someone would ask something like, imagine an American guy. Okay, and then DALL-E comes up with this image of like a young white guy wearing like a t-shirt and jeans, standing on a busy street in New York. Okay, so that's step one. And then the person who's like in the meme would keep going, right? They would be like, more American, even more American, like the final form of American, right? So images start getting really intense and ridiculous. And then by the end, it was literally like a Big Mac wearing an American flag and holding handguns, and there were like bald eagles circling. That was the final form of an American, according to DALL-E. Okay? What's going on here? The meme is not subtle at all, right? But it does highlight something that's interesting and kind of insidious about linguistic, I guess, an insidious linguistic tool that AI and we as human beings both use. So it's called generics, okay? Very quickly, generics are used to track and represent information about groups that we find in common. So for instance, ducks lay eggs, right? It's information that we think ducks share, or like features that we think ducks share. First gen students are hard workers, another generic statement, okay? You're making a statement about this group of animals or human beings. And we use generics all the time when we talk, and we just don't even notice it, right? But when we use them to talk about social kinds, like human groups, we can run into some ethical issues, okay? So for instance, just one of the problem is that generics sometimes contribute to essentializing and stereotyping groups of people, okay? So for instance, if you hear women are nurturing, you might think women are nurturing because of some, deep like essence about women that makes it so that they display the feature of being nurturing. They are nurturing because they're women. Okay, you might read into that. And the simple generic statement might lead you to form beliefs that are really kind of, not that correct. Okay. Or if you hear single moms are less valued members of American society than married women with children. Okay, so if that comes up, what's conveyed, it's not just that some single mothers, because of how they are as individuals, end up somehow, become less valued. Rather, we might be suggesting with that sentence that there's something structural in our society that makes it so that single moms are generally, as a group, less valued. Okay, so that's very interesting about generics. So there are pros and cons, right? Pros, we can use generics to convey structural regularities in the social world. Cons, perpetuating stereotypes. Okay, just as an example. Okay, so how does all of this relate to AI? So one of the projects that I have going on now is exploring how ChatGPT uses generic statements and how it should use generic statements. Okay, so it's really fun because as part of my research, I just have conversations with ChatGPT and then I record the responses and then I categorize the responses. Okay, so for instance, one issue that I wanted to highlight is how subtly information from ChatGPT or from generative AI in general can mislead. Okay, so ChatGPT doesn't need to intend to give us false information, right? It doesn't even need to give us false information. It can give us accurate information that ends up misleading us, okay? So it can produce information that's really accurate based on statistics, for instance, because ChatGPT has a lot of access and the training data has a lot of statistics built in there. But it still ends up misleading us because the information is delivered in a form maybe that's in a generic or some other sort of tricky linguistic form. Okay. For instance, this sentence, disproportionately more Black Americans are arrested than white Americans. Statistically correct, but can be interpreted to be conveying two very different things, right? So someone might attribute this higher arrest rate to systemic racism and other social issues. Someone else might use it to confirm their biases and attribute the higher arrest rate to something essential within Black Americans. Okay, so these two people would come away with very different beliefs based on the same generic statement, which statement itself is based on accurate statistics. So what do we do about this? A couple of things. So I guess at the technological level, how do we allow ChatGPT to use generics, right? There are several solutions that might be worth exploring. So I'll just quickly mention a couple. So one option, very extreme, would be that we as programmers make it so that ChatGPT never uses or accepts generics. What's wrong with this? Well, that's not very feasible because ChatGPT is kind of like a generalizing algorithm. That's just kind of how it works. And also human beings, we use generics. And so if we design ChatGPT to talk in a very different way than we do, then information also gets lost, right? We want ChatGPT to be able to speak similarly that we do. So, that's not very feasible. We could go with another option. So generalize if that's what the data suggests. So allowing ChatGPT to do so, right? Except in social cases, and then add a disclaimer. Okay. That's an option in between. Another option might be generalize except when it comes to highly marginalized or vulnerable social groups. Okay. So the pros here, this is kind of what ChatGPT does now. If you so in my hundreds of conversations that I've had with ChatGPT, this is kind of the default strategy that ChatGPT employs. It will make a generalization if there's a lot of statistical information to back it up, but it will say something like, but of course, we're all individuals and we cannot, generalize about groups, but it did, right? So it does that, right? It just slaps a disclaimer on there. The cons, okay? Generics can be useful, like we said, for communicating social structural regularities. So should we program ChatGPT to never say something like, Black people face discrimination? I feel like that's also wrong, right? We want ChatGPT to be able to say that. So that's not a very helpful option either. So I think my favorite so far, but I still need to think more about it, of course, is allowing ChatGPT to generalize and then just really improve the disclaimers. Okay. So the pros, best of all worlds, allows for useful generalizations. At the same time, may be helpful for preventing essentializing in some cases, right? The shortcoming is how to implement this. And I've been thinking about this a lot. It's really hard. Okay. So I think we need more resources and research devoted to this type of problem in AI ethics, specifically, not just the technology of producing an AI model that people will use. Okay. So we need more students to work on these issues. Okay. So that's kind of structural, technological. What can we do? Psychologically, as individuals, there's a couple of things that we can do too. So first, we should keep in mind that it's not enough to keep track of what content is AI generated versus not, because that's one thing that people have been talking about. Oh, you don't know that you're reading fake news because that was just AI generated, right? But it's getting so good at doing so that we can't tell the real from the fake. That's not the only issue though, right? So even if the information is human generated, AI generated, the information itself could still be good or bad, right? So all sorts of information can mislead for a variety of reasons, regardless of the origin. Okay, so that's one thing to keep in mind as individuals. Secondly, I think we should keep in mind that even accurate information can be ambiguous, right? So we can try to learn more about linguistic devices like generics. So that's one thing that we could do. Maybe learn more about how we should interpret the information that we're presented with. Okay, so just be mindful of that. Maybe when a sentence is ambiguous and then can be interpreted in multiple ways, what we should do is keep digging for additional information to confirm how that sentence should be interpreted. Okay, and if there are stable regularities within a social group, and that's what the generic statement is reflecting, we should investigate what's actually causing the regularities rather than kind of taking it at face value as just being accurate and objective information that's conveyed. Okay, that's all I have.
I think we're ready for some questions. I'll let y'all cook for a minute. I'm gonna get the ball rolling. So I'm posing this question to everybody, but I know Professor Heron in particular will have some thoughts on this. So most strategies proposed to combat misinformation encourages individuals to ensure for themselves that the information they consume is coming from a credible source. But I feel this is becoming more and more difficult given the current replication crisis and increase of research fraud in the social sciences. So my first question is if any of you would be willing to explain what that is for those of you who aren't familiar. And my follow-up question is what can we do both as academics and as individuals who are consuming this information to combat misinformation when a lot of supposed credible sources are being brought into question?
Oh, we're leading off with an easy one, right? Okay, nice softball question. Okay, so first off, you wanted an explanation of kind of the problem in publishing, in academic publishing. We are seeing a kind of an uptick in problems. We talked about this a little in class on our first day, where you actually have had a large number of retractions of scholarly work done in the last couple of years. It's actually gone up notably, in which they found that you have AI-generated content, you have content that's just, it's basically dummy papers that don't really have any real content to them. In some cases, you have empty, citations that go nowhere. And the problem with these, one, as we talked about in class, part of the problem with this isn't so much the papers themselves. Lots of stuff gets published, stuff does get retracted. But the problem is the sheer amount of this is a first large problem. The second problem is, of course, that when these papers get cited and actually end up in people's literature reviews and otherwise, they've now become intermeshed into the actual system of scholarly communication and academic publishing. That they now are here. They're actually, entwined into a system where you have these dummy papers, these AI-generated papers, these sometimes nonsense papers that are now, thoroughly enmeshed with papers that are actually good. And this is a problem, right? Because the whole idea of the system of peer review and the idea of scholarly journals and the like was to create, if you will, a gold standard of scholarship, right? This is where these are the things. I mean, it's not perfectly safe. Clearly, these things have biases and issues. But the idea was that these should be somewhat more trustworthy than just something you find on the open web. And with issues like this, this becomes a little bit more of a problem and more of a complicating influence. Your second question?
The second part of the question is basically, what can we do about it?
Well, on the individual end, not as much as you might hope for. This is something that's much more, I think, a structural and institutional issue. This is something where, to some degree, the onus here is a lot on scholarly publishers to begin with, that they need to be, taking the proper efforts to make sure that there's good peer review, that there's good quality control involved in these things, that if necessary, so much of peer review is reliant on volunteer labor. It's very possible that in some cases we should be remunerating peer reviewers for their work, which may help to some degree with this, may not. But yeah, a lot of this is probably just a matter of being more closely engaged with what is getting published and doing a better job of identifying predatory publishers who will publish anything for for a certain amount of money. I bring this up because there have been some particularly egregious examples that have more recently floated around online where it's absolutely clear that the paper was generated by AI, because you actually have the AI prompts and things. Well, as a large language model, blah blah blah, I think this, and it's where you're going, how in the world did this get past? Who looked at this? I'm getting dinged for having one too many commas in a sentence, and this got there. I don't know. Maybe library science journals are really more persnickety. Who knows? I don't know. Anyways, that would be my thoughts. Sorry. You guys have thoughts?
I'll just say a couple things. I don't really have a good answer for this. I think that it's definitely more institutional, right? It's not a thing that we as individuals kind of like really quickly figure out what's going on. But I do think that aside from the editor's side, it's also the fact that in academia, there's a lot of there's a lot of pressure to produce a lot of research and publish. And this is what might drive some people, some researchers, to use ChatGPT or to just, I don't know, what did you call them? Like dummy papers?
Yeah.
Or whatever. Yeah, just make up some stuff so that they can get published, right? So that's not helping. So maybe if that pressure were a little bit less, that could be helpful. Yeah, I think that's the main thing I wanted to say.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I would also mention that, so I can speak to my field, which is social psychology, which has actually had one or two high-profile people have papers detected with fraud, like fraudulent data in particular. One of them even like a Harvard Business School professor, Francesca Gino. You may have heard that name in the news. But basically, so I think number one, it is actually good that we are now systematically starting to be able to detect fraudulent papers and fraudulent data. I don't think that we had as robust of systems in place as before, and I think that's why you're currently seeing more of this. So that's one thing that I wanted to add. And then the other is that right now, especially in social psychology, the field that I got my PhD in, we have a push where all of the studies that you do in order to get into one of the top social psychology journals, and I think, understanding what journals those are is something that needs to be more widely understood. The papers are often behind paywall access. So like the super high quality stuff is actually less accessible to the public, which I think is also a problem. But to stop getting myself sidetracked, there's a big movement in social psychology that has also spread to other fields, right? Called open science. This means that all the studies that you do have to have publicly available data that should be fully anonymized, so that other scientists in the field or other interested people can look at your data directly and replicate what you've done. The other standard now is that you also provide like code for statistical software. So you can literally just like download the data set, open this code, and like run it. And it should produce the exact same graphs and the exact same tables that are in the paper. So like this is now becoming like the standard in social psychology if you want to be published in a top journal. And I think it's a good thing that we are doing this, because also the repositories for this data also host places where you can get like, so on one hand, it's good because it's helping papers and this information get out to the public instead of sitting behind paywalls where only people with university access can have it. On the other hand, people are also kind of taking advantage of this to put out papers before they've been peer reviewed. Or like, they'll have like data that replicates and stuff, but the paper will not have been peer reviewed, and it's already been given like a 10 tweet Twitter thread that's gone viral, right? And it's never been through peer review. And there's actually a lot of this going on, funny enough, in misinformation research. I won't name any names, but there are some labs that do this. So on one hand, I think like the open science movement and making data accessible, like I don't expect the average person to go in and run the statistical analyses on my psych papers, right? Or on like a misinformation paper or whatever topic they want. But the fact that that's there and that other people can check it, I think is a good, is a pretty robust check mark against people falsifying data and things like that, which is good. And it's something that psychology is really embracing and I think needs to keep doing. However, there's a lot of historical papers out there that do not have accessible or open data. And so I think that you should critically evaluate things that are even in top scientific journals and be like, okay, this was one study done with 50 undergraduates in 1975. We don't have any replicatable data for it. Like this, we should probably test this again now in a new context. And there are labs doing that, right? There are labs seeking to replicate these findings. Are they robust? How big are the effects? How many times can we get it to work in a new sample? Do they generalize to all people, or is it just American college students that you can find this effect among, right? So I think like those kind of questions, you should ask these kind of questions, even if you're evaluating a piece of scientific research, and like know that there are people working to make it better and to detect fraud, but also think like, you know, if it's just one study that shows this evidence, I want to see more, right?
So before we take some more questions, I want to let people know we have a post-event survey that we would love for you to fill out, and 5 people who fill it out will get some of our CCEP swag. We have a fancy tote bag, and we got notebooks and tumblers in here, so please fill out the survey. Also, follow us on all the socials, and sign up for our mailing list and follow our podcast. People who are following along at home on Zoom, you can type your questions in the chat and we will ask them for you as well. Okay, so on that note, anybody here? Yes.
So this is kind of for whoever wants to answer this, but I had written out, do you worry that the initial conditions of the rise of AI are systemically linked to the social economic structures that develop them, such that capitalistic systems will inherently tend towards capital-based incentives, and that truth-based algorithms will be potentially idealistic and or harder to raise? If so, what is the amendment to this? Then I brought up like regulation, education, economic reform, and reconstructuring. Because if you know about you may know about the paperclip analogy, where you say initial conditions may lead to, saying, a paperclip machine trying to optimize how to make paperclips, and then it says, oh, maybe, you know, I can bend it this way and that way, and then that increases efficiency by 20%. But then eventually it might say, hey, well, there's medical, you know, these humans are mining my resources, shut down the hospitals, see an asteroid belt, yada, yada. The experiment goes, you know, into abstraction of the universe being made out of paperclips. So I have worries about economic structures leading to profit-based incentives, and that potentially being purely systemic, and maybe we would be unable to, you know, attack that.
Okay, I'll start. Let's see. So that's a great question. I think I don't know that much about how those companies operate, but I would think, okay, so I do know one person that's building like a large language model for like a tech startup, right? And it seems like the incentive is, well, you said, okay, it's like either economic or truth-based. What if we just want the truth, and then like you build one that's like the best for giving people the information that they need? So say, you know, a lot of students use ChatGPT for like not just writing papers, but also finding out facts, right? So if your algorithm proves to be the best one for that one, isn't that like a economically related incentive? I think maybe that's too idealistic, but
yeah, I can speak to this a little bit, because I think one thing that you see pretty commonly with tech companies is, I think the ethos of Silicon Valley was to move fast and break things for a long time. I think we're seeing now, at least, some of the companies that have that backfire a bit, right? They're under a lot of threats of regulation, all these kind of things. The what happens with a lot of these AI and large scale language models is that people deploy them. It becomes a race to deploy the biggest and best thing the fastest without as much or enough concern for the safety of the users of these models, what these models are doing in terms of like, producing this kind of information that has a lot of generics in it, or like, and people also don't have, like, not all the users of these large scale language models necessarily have the information to know, like, okay, ChatGPT can be incorrect, or ChatGPT like hallucinates like information, right? Like it can, like, for example, like it told my academic advisor, it like she asked it for a summary of some research, and GPT made up a paper that she had written, and she was like, I didn't write that paper, right? So I think like the race for profitability and to be the first one, that I think is kind of inherent to technology being developed in a capitalist system, can result in a lot of harms for the users of technologies. And I think that's one reason that we need to like ensure that, like, I think that we should learn from the mistakes that we made with social media companies, and not wait to do more with respect to regulation around large-scale language models and these new technologies, because I think giving them such a wide berth on harms is not acceptable.
I'm going to agree with Ian on this one, though I will also point out, and this is going to sound very cynical, so apologies. The companies who are right now developing AI, or at least who are heavily funding the development of AI, are all publicly traded, which means that they all are in the market cycle of needing to show returns for their stockholders. So what we've seen, and we've seen this with social media, we've seen this with Google to a degree, we've seen this throughout kind of Silicon Valley and its the various industries that have come out of it, is that ultimately, given a choice between quality and profitability, they choose profitability. Okay, and as I wish I could say that in a way that sounded a little less jaundiced, but that's the simple truth of this. So we're likely to see, without proper regulatory guardrails of some sort, as Ian's pointed out, we're likely to see AI that does what Facebook looks like now, or what Twitter looks like now, or the like, where ultimately the venture capital dried up, and now we need to make sure the investors are getting paid. And so there you have it.
Hi, so we have our first question from the chat. This one was specifically directed to Tiffany, but anyone can answer if they want to. So with the second proposal you gave about allowing ChatGPT to still generalize, but offer a disclaimer in the instance that it's asked about social issues or like human social groups, this person's wondering how you might respond to some critics who say that social issues are really indicative of structural oppression, i.e. racism and its role in the over-policing and mass incarceration of Black men, but are then being reduced to being an issue of economics or socialization, like how individuals are raised and in what kind of communities.
Wait, okay. So when I say social groups, it's just anything in the social world, right? So if the fact that all of those factors are contributing to how our social groups right now are formed, then that's included, right? So the second suggestion, generalize if that's what the data suggests, except for in social cases, and always that disclaimer, that is not a good option, right? So I think the complications there just make it more clear that it's not very easy to achieve or to execute that kind of regulation, norm, whatever you want to call it.
I have a question regarding this problem. So in thinking about the different solutions we can, approach this problem of misinformation through AI with, I think a lot of the ones that are often brought up are human intervention. It is to say, okay, this is something people commonly, misconstrue through generics, and this is something that the AI is misconstruing, therefore let's intervene. But I think that in many respects, like the benefits of AI are in the fact that it is a dynamically updating model. When we think about like confusion, right? Like what I might be confused by or what I might misinterpret is different from what someone in another country might misinterpret, because our languages are different and our sort of symbolic structures are different. As such, I think that it may, like I'm curious if you would think that there's like potential in making like more algorithmic based solutions to these types of misinformation problems. Because I would imagine, right, like classic examples like energy, right? There's energy from like a physicist perspective where we're relating it specifically to work done by a force over distance. Or let's say a work is force over distance. It's a vector sum, right? But that's like a specific context. And I would imagine that if someone asked, what is energy? Right? If the AI was programmed to specifically look for descriptions of energy, which are sourced from academic institutions, as opposed to the internet, I would imagine that in a sense, it could develop like a dual language. It could develop a language for like, what are the conversations people in academia are having? How are they talking about it? What are the conversations people are like lay people are having? How are they talking about it? And what are like the differences that are like emerging out of those? Because I think if you do that, it might, help sourcing.
I have a couple ideas, I guess. One of the things that I think is talked about a decent amount, but also like it's also been a problem with research on AI and GPT in particular, is that you can kind of tell it to take on different personas, right? Like the skill of the prompter also like relates, and like the specificity of the prompt that you give it also like relates to the quality of the information that it gives you. It can also, undermine the quality of its information, as we mentioned here, by like giving you things that it's kind of made up. Even if you ask it for academic information, it's limited fundamentally by its training data, right? Like it can't give you anything that's not within that. And I think right now, even the most updated version is like ends at 2021, 2022 or something like that. But that being said, like knowing how to ask it for the type of information you want is a skill that I think people could foster and develop. But at the same time, on the other side, like you also have the designers and the people building these systems that should, a lot of them probably are experts on using these things as well, because they've spent a lot of time testing their own product, right? So it's going to be important for people to like research how regular people use and respond to it, as well as people who are like more expert, and how like that learning process occurs over time, right? So there are psychologists starting to do this research, but it's pretty new at the moment. And also like different types of prompts giving different type of things, like you can simulate what a certain type of person would say, but then you also run into the problem where people could just simulate someone who's going to give them only the information and answers that they want, right? So it's not like a panacea by any means.
The one thing I want to caution you about is to be careful about how much faith you have in algorithms and even AI. I mean, when we just start talking about large language models, what are they being fed? Their training material is material that has been written by human beings. Original algorithms, at least, are written by human beings. The system itself may start generating new ones based on its own experience, but the base stuff, the base code, if you will, was still written by us. And therefore, it contains all of the prejudices, all the stereotypes, all of the whatever that makes human beings with all of our messiness. So therefore, we cannot necessarily expect of AI to be any more perfect than we are, because we're training it off of us. Okay, any more than I can expect my children necessarily to be any better than I am when they're being raised by me. One could hope, but nonetheless. But the idea here being, I think we need to be careful of that. I did like what Ian mentioned about training the AI to do this from a certain perspective. A while back, I went and played with ChatGPT, and some people heard the story. I was feeling particularly mischievous, I guess. I told it, write me a university mission statement in the style of H.P. Lovecraft, okay, who
Those of you who are familiar, he wrote the Cthulhu Mythos. The dude has a very specific kind of writing style. He wrote for pulp magazines. It did it. And surprisingly, it was actually pretty good. I mean, it was shockingly good for what you could do it. Though I found rather nicely, though, when I told it to write me a poem about soup in the style of T.S. Eliot, it couldn't do that. So there's apparently still a limit out there, but Eliot's pretty hard, so I'll give it a pass. So yeah, there is the idea that you can get the AI to tell you what you want if you know how to do this, and telling you what you want isn't the same as telling someone the truth. The AI can tell me I can eat as much sugar as I like and it won't affect my glucose levels. That's great. It's not true. Makes me feel real good, but when I then hit the glucometer on my finger, the thing explodes because the numbers are off the chart. There you go.
In the same vein, do you think there's something psychological about that? How we feel like it's coming from a computer, we feel like it's coming from a calculator, so it must be true because, I can't remember who said it, but these generalizations, right? If it was coming from a friend, I don't expect something coming from my very smart friend to be 100% accurate. I also know where my friend is coming from. So if they make a generalization about the proportion of somebody in prison or whatever, I know them as a person, so I can understand they probably mean it in the way of this, not this. And you can't tell that when it's coming from a computer. We're treating, and I feel like I do that. I treat it like it's coming from a calculator, not this human fed kind of just repetitive. It's just spitting out things that we've put in it. There has to be something psychological about that, right? It must be true. It's coming from this machine.
So I do know of some research on that, so I can speak to that. So one thing that has been studied actually already was people did a fun experiment that just came out that was they had people who had conspiracy beliefs interact with ChatGPT versus a person. And then they asked them how much they still believe in the conspiracy theory right afterwards, and then they also asked them again about it later. And GPT was better at this than people. So actually the GPT was able to convince people who have conspiracy theory beliefs to let go of them a little bit. And they have all sorts of kind of reasoning about why this is, but one of the reasons one of the things that I saw when I was looking at the paper was it seems like people were mapping that GPT is more trustworthy, it's more objective, it's using language that it's interesting because the same language, what they found was also using the same language and just manipulating who the people thought it was from, they trust GPT more, right? And that's because they view the human as overly overly emotional or not sympathetic enough, and GPT they don't map these things onto it, right? So I've gotten a little lost in the research and then want to come back to your question. The basic idea is that there is something, at least now when these things are new, and the way that we interact with them, especially I think in initial interactions where we're oh, this is super trustworthy. I can take everything that this says is pretty much gospel, and this is actually better than talking to a human for getting information. I think that this will probably start to as often happens with technologies, people's opinions about it change, and the interactions that you have with that technology and whether or not you trust it change a lot over time as well. So I think that variable also will probably have an effect over time. And again, also as people interact and engage with it more, they'll either begin to trust its expertise more or feel actually this thing's telling me wrong stuff a lot of the time. I'm going to trust its expertise less. And we don't know much about what's going to happen there because it hasn't been around that long. And we don't have a lot of people who have used it for years and years. So
we got 1 more minute left. So one quick question. Here we go. And get some sandwiches on your way out.
So one of my favorite papers recently about the role of social media in disinformation is Regina Rini's paper, Weaponizing Skepticism, right? So in that paper, she points out that skepticism is weaponized, right? Now, she's not the first person to point this out. Naomi Oreskes and Jeff Conway have pointed out there's nothing new about weaponizing skepticism. It's been done. The tobacco industry did it, right? Climate change deniers. But the social media sort of allows you to level up with respect to weaponizing skepticism. She says, look, we have two options. We could disarm, and this is what I'm curious to hear your view about, which would be sift, training, get people, right? And she says, I'm going to quote her here, is there anything we can do to stop this process? I think we have two options for handling weaponized skepticism: disarm or detonate. In an ideal world, we disarm the threat, right? We'd focus on educating, but I'm increasingly doubtful that this approach will work. Individual users, and this is what I'm curious about, individual users seem to have little motivation towards epistemic scrupulousness. Perhaps this is not surprising, given that most people use social media for entertainment or boredom alleviation, not to do epistemic labor. Right. And so if that's true, all of this education stuff is probably not going to work. And that's what leads her to say detonate. Either get rid of it or encourage, right, generalized skepticism about anything on social media. I mean, all of it. Right. That's her detonate. So I'm just curious if you think there might be a middle ground here, or is the fact that our primary use for using social media has nothing to do with epistemic considerations going to doom us?
I guess I can also start on this. It's a targeted social media question, so I'll start on it. So I think that's one of the things that when I was talking about what our existing social media habits are and what they're formed around, like in the case of scrolling, which is a bit less studied, but information consumption. So my dissertation work looks at how people who are really strongly habitual in their scrolling behavior actually like spend less time on posts that they're really interested in. So like their scrolling behavior actually starts to become untethered from the things that in isolation they're like, oh, I'm really interested in that. And I think like taking that kind of view on it, where, as you said, like people aren't necessarily on there because they're trying to like make critical evaluations of like pieces of news or pieces of facts, and those are often jumbled in with all sorts of other types of content, right? Like, and everyone's feed is different on top of that, right? Like every feed is customized. Some people really go on there because they want to see news and learn things. Other people just want to see cat videos like all day, like give me that. Right. So it's like the ways that which people use social media are very heterogeneous. And there's research showing that like when you're kind of in this habitual scrolling and habitual state of information consumption, like you're kind of in almost a flow state. And unless something disrupts that, you're not going to be thinking in a super like goal directed manner, which I think is also why something that happens a little bit with the sharing studies that I did, like the pathway to just, and the barriers to doing the thing that spreads the misinfo is so low because of the platform, the way the platform is designed and incentivized. Like it's hard to turn on that system that says, hey, let's like stop and think and look at this source and like go hover over the page, right? It's tough to train yourself to do that because the platform is channeling you in a different direction. So fighting, like, yes, like these, and that's one of the things. It's like individualized solutions can help. Like it's not like they're completely useless, but at the same time, like the things that have the real power to direct our behavior on social media are like the structure and the design of the platforms. So I think approaching information that you see on social media in general with skepticism is probably a good idea, particularly with respect to news and info. But I think like different information domains have different levels of skepticism that you should probably be applying, right? So it is a really tough question. I tend to agree that skepticism, you should lean towards being skeptical of things that you see online.
Okay, unfortunately, we're out of time. I think we could go for another hour otherwise. So please join me in thanking our panelists. Get some sandwiches, fill out the survey, and we'll see you next year.
On behalf of CCEP, we'd like to thank the students who worked together over the past year to put together this podcast series, the guests who agreed to be interviewed and recorded for these episodes, and our CCEP faculty fellows for their ongoing advice. A special thanks also to the Cal Poly Pomona Special Projects for Improving the Classroom Experience Grant Program for making this series possible. And finally, once again, thank you so much for listening.